Hi there. So in this video, we're going to look at the second lecture on monopoly. We're going to use the same page that we drew the artificial ones, but this we're going to look at is what we call a natural monopoly. Now, a natural monopoly is a little different from an artificial monopoly, and I want to distinguish the two before we actually draw the graphs. A natural monopoly is different from an artificial, and an artificial is one where you might have, as I said in the last video, just one small shop in a small town, and they're the only one who provide the bicycle repairs, right? So it's kind of artificially that they're actually the monopolist. It's not like that it makes sense for that to be the case, but they just happen to be the only store that sells the product. So their cost curves look pretty much the same if we were to say there's 3 or 4 of the bicycle stores. They have the same kind of cost curves. A natural monopoly, though, is a special type of monopoly where there's only one company that provides the good or service still, but it's the nature of the market that makes it so that it actually makes sense for there to only be one company that does this service. And I'll give you a really concrete example of this. It would be like a water company. It doesn't make a lot of sense to have 2 different water companies with both of them laying sewer pipes and water pipes to everybody's house, or even 3 or 4 or 5 of these water companies. You'd have tons of water pipes, and it wouldn't make any sense to have that. It actually makes perfect sense to have just one. Now, there's actually a formal definition of a natural monopoly, and that's the idea that the demand for the product, like whatever demand for this product in a geographical area exists, can actually be satisfied by one company within the downward sloping range of the average total cost. And so that would actually be like, imagine if you had just this downward sloping range of ATC and just this downward sloping range of marginal cost. And if instead of being a demand curve that did that, if the demand curve did like whoop, like that, really steep. And so the only part of the quantity that you actually see is the part where it's downward sloping. So that's actually kind of, it's almost like you're zooming in on the quantity side of one of these graphs. So they're still going to have the demand and the marginal revenue do this. So we're going to start the same way. Quantity and price. And this is one of these where it might actually be handy to pop into the Google Meet if you have a question, right? Demand equals the price. And then we've got marginal revenue, just like that. So we have exactly the same graph as before. But in this one, we're going to do a slightly different thing with this marginal cost and this average cost curve. So this is a picture of what it looks like in profit. Now, technically, this marginal cost should probably start a little bit high and hook down, just like the ATC does in that purple line. But it's okay if you draw it as a vertical or as a horizontal line, as a straight line straight across. So actually, like really technically, it should look kind of like this, one of these. Marginal cost equals supply. And we know that eventually it'll start to go back up again, right? It's kind of like this. It goes down and then flattens and then comes back up again. But within the range for the demand for the product, we're kind of in this downward sloping range. And again, you could draw it as a straight horizontal line as well. And then the average cost is also going to do one of these. It's going to kind of come down, and it will actually approach that marginal cost curve. So sometimes they get closer and closer, and they become an asymptote. And eventually, as we know, right, eventually the ATC will cross the MC, MC will start to rise, and so forth. But for which the demand exists, for which the product exists here, we're only going to be in the downward sloping range because it only makes sense to have one water company. Now, all of the rules that we already established still apply. They produce the quantity where MR equals MC, they price on the demand curve, and you then compare price to the ATC. So we're going to do that. Marginal cost and the marginal revenue is here, so that we find Q star. And then it's kind of like a yellow brick road, if you notice in my little diagram. And we're going to go up to the demand curve to find the price, right? And that's a little bit cattywampus, but that's okay. And then we go over price, that's P star. So again, it's exactly the same way that we found the quantity and the price before. It doesn't change. And now we just go down to the ATC, because remember, this is a case where the price is bigger than the ATC at the MR equals MC point. And so we compare those two values. That's the profit per unit, the vertical distance there. And then we go across, and we can draw our profit rectangle, just like that. Okay, so it looks actually pretty similar to the other one. The cost curves are just a little bit different. Now we're going to draw the one in loss. And this one, we draw it exactly the same way to start. We have our downward sloping demand equals the price. We start up here, marginal revenue coming down like that. And then for this one, right, you're going to want to kind of put your marginal cost like that, MC equals supply. And we know that they're going to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's the quantity, Q star. Where do they price? They price on the demand curve. So we go up, find the price, P star. But if it's in a loss, then that means the price is less than the ATC. So we're going to have to draw the ATC above, and it's going to kind of come down and get close and close and close. And we never quite see where it starts to come back up again, because remember, it's a natural monopoly. And so we compare price to ATC, and we say, oh, look at that. The ATC is above the price. And we connect those. That's the loss per unit. We go over, and this is the loss rectangle. So it's a natural monopoly and a loss. And you can see they actually look pretty similar again. Now we're going to do a natural monopoly in normal, break-even, or fair return. Those are all words meaning the exact same thing. Normal profit, break-even, fair return. They all mean the same thing. Don't be confused. The economists like to use different words just to confuse high school students, but you're not going to get confused. You're great. So in this one, it's a little bit wonky, right? I'll show you the picture here. So we can do our little, this is marginal cost, MC equals supply. And again, you don't need to have that little hooky-do if you don't want to. I like it. It makes me feel like I'm a little bit more technical, right? We know that MR equals MC, that's the quantity where we're going to produce. We're going to price up here on the demand curve, and I encourage you to do this part first. Price up on the demand curve. And notice it's exactly the same in every single one of these graphs, right? It's exactly the same, price on the demand curve. And then to do this one, it's the ATC is going to come down, just touch, and then come over and do one of those, just like that. And again, you can make your dot nice and big, and that way everybody knows, oh yeah, those lines are supposed to be crossing there. And again, there's no rectangle because we're breaking even. Now, there's one additional concept I want to show you, and that's actually the relationship of elasticity, marginal revenue, demand, and total revenue for monopoly. And this is a little bit of a review of this water bottles thing that we did in the last video. And this one is really just an interesting trick that we will find to be the case. Just like we did before when we did, the elasticities. And we said, okay, we've got a demand curve that tells us the price, and we've got this marginal revenue curve like that, just like that. We did this same graph back in Unit 2, and we did total revenue. Now there's a fun little thing here that we can find, that we remember that there's this midpoint of the demand curve, and that's where it's unit elastic. Remember that? That's unit elastic. And then we remember that this range is the inelastic range. And as it gets further down that way, it gets even closer and closer to zero for price elasticity of demand. And as we get this range, this is the elastic range. And as we go further up the curve, that price elasticity gets closer and closer to infinity. But what's kind of interesting is if we continue that down here and we plotted out the total revenues, right, these values here, 0, it would max out at 25. And that's actually the point, the midpoint of that demand curve. And so that point is 25. And so it kind of does one of these. Down like that. And this point is the total revenue maximization point. Now, a really easy question that you're going to see on a test is going to be just this graph at the top. And it's going to say, at what quantity is total revenue maximized? And it's pretty simple. It's the point where MR crosses the x-axis. That's because at that point, that's where marginal revenue goes from being like, a positive number here to going to being negative. And so wherever that is, where marginal revenue hits 0, is where the total revenue is maximized, is where the demand curve is unit elastic. And so there are some relationships here to observe. If marginal revenue is greater than 0, then you know that you're in the elastic range, right? And you also know that if marginal revenue is greater than 0 and you lower the price, right? You lower the price, well, what happens to total revenue? It should go up. And that's because you're in the elastic range. Remember, price goes down, total revenue goes up. You're in the elastic range. So all you'd need to know, I could tell you marginal revenue is greater than 0 and you lower the price. What happens? Well, you lower the price, total revenue goes up because you're in the elastic range. And if marginal revenue is less than 0, you know you're in the inelastic range. And you know that if you lower the price even further, well, what happens to total revenue? It goes down. So there's some relationships here and all this stuff that I hope that you kind of start to observe. Okay, hopefully this helped you. See you next time.